Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Fluency and Equity, Helping All Kids Access Grade-Level Text. My name is Derek Vargason, Senior Marketing Manager with NWEA, and I will be host for today's presentation. Wherever you are, thanks for joining us and taking time out of your busy day to attend our webinar today. Before we get started, let's go over a few logistics. During today's presentation, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. We encourage you to please submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A box. We'll answer as many as we can, both in the Q&A window and at our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. You'll receive an email with a recording and the PDF of the slides of today's presentation via email. After the webinar, you'll see a short survey. Please take a minute to fill that out. Let us know how we did and what content you'd like to see covered in future webinars. I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers, our panelists. We're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Tim Rasinski. Tim is a professor of literacy education at Kent State University and director of its award-winning reading clinic. He's written over 200 articles and authored or co-authored or edited over 50 books or curriculum programs on reading education. He's held leadership positions with the International Reading Association, Journal of Literacy Research, and the College Reading Association, and he's a 2010 inductee to the International Reading Hall of Fame. Lynne Kulich supports early learning solutions at NWEA. She's a former professor, teacher, data coach, and curriculum instruction director from Ohio. She holds a bachelor's degree in foreign language education, master's degree in elementary education, and a doctoral degree in curriculum and instruction. Early childhood literacy is her passion. And Cindy Jiban is the principal academic lead for early learning at NWEA. Her job is to design assessment content that helps us understand what our youngest students know and are ready to learn. Cindy's a former classroom teacher and instructional coach, as well as an experienced and federally funded researcher on early literacy assessment. So with that, I will turn it over to Cindy. Cindy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Derek. I'm going to jump right in. First, I'm going to give a little background on today's topic. So NWEA convened a Literacy Leaders Council, and this brought together a variety of thought leadership perspectives for NWEA, and to bring that to bear on decisions and directions that focus on content in literacy. So after a set of meetings of this impressive group, we got to some clarity around what these leaders agreed are critical pieces for us. One was a focus on fluency, and another was a focus on complex grade-level text. So today, these topics are coming together. We're lucky to feature Tim Rasinski from this Literacy Leaders Council, arguably the leading voice on fluency. So what I want to focus on is an important reality as a starting point. There's kind of a central problem that we face in teaching all kids in literacy, and that is that not all kids are at the same level of reading proficiency, right? So we know we have grade level text at a given level, but we also know sometimes that the level that we might say a student is at is different. So historically, some schools and classrooms have addressed that by selecting easier text for a child. So this is fourth grade, right? But previously, we might have basically been saying, this group of kids, you're going to see second grade text instead, because that's where you're at, right? So that's what we were saying. But I'm concerned that this is about failing on the equity front. So by lowering our expectations for some kids, what we're doing is we're ensuring that we're not going to get us to those equitable outcomes. So we want to get kids college and career ready, and that's a really high aspirational target. And it needs to remain a high aspirational target for everyone. So I really like this statement about what that equity means. The goals and expectations are the same for all students, but the supports needed to achieve those goals depend on the student's needs. So some of you no doubt are familiar with a kind of a big splash paper that came out, The Opportunity Myth. So this reported about an observational study. So observers were in classrooms in many different settings, and they looked carefully at the materials and expectations, and they watched what was considered student success. And here's what they found. Over 2/3 of the students were called successful. But at the same time, only 17% of the kids were actually meeting grade level standards. So what happened there? Clearly the goals and expectations were not held the same. They were lowered. Okay, but so some teachers will be wondering, yeah, but what if I'm teaching the standards, right? Can't you meet grade level standards but use text that's easier and meets the kids at their level? And really the answer is no. Text complexity is a part of the standards, right? We're looking at the Common Core here, but that's not just true in the Common Core state standards, but across states. Meeting the standard means grade level text. So why is that? Grade level text, complex, rich text, it's important because it offers new vocabulary and knowledge. And it also develops students' understanding of more complex language. So research shows us that even though we think that we're speaking to students with high-level language, we don't really get there in the same way that good written text does. So our kids need that high-level written text in order to have the opportunity to really develop their vocabulary, their syntactic complexity and language understanding, and their knowledge. So what does the research say, though, about grade level text and fluency, kind of focusing especially on concerns people have around readers who struggle? Well, in this study, fluency work with grade level text is effective. And here's another study that really highlighted that it's not the level of text that matters so much as what you do with it. So I would argue that we need to change the question. It's not about, well, which of these texts is right for my student? Instead, I think that what we need to be asking is, how do I bring this student to this text? So that's a really important ramp right there, right? So what's in that ramp? What is it? How can we scaffold and support? So fluency is a huge part of the answer. And today that's where we're going to focus. So first, we're going to look at that fluency practice with Tim Rasinski. And Tim, before we jump into looking at these great fluency practices, I just want to ask you a couple questions here, kind of framing back to this equity issue. First, what would you like people to think about as they're making choices about what text that they should use with kids?
Yeah, hi, Cindy, and everyone out there. Thanks for having me, NWEA. Great question. What kinds of text should we be thinking about? I think, you answered that yourself, at least partially. One of the things we should be thinking about is material that is going to take students to where they need to be. If you're a fourth grader reading at a second grade level, a second grade text is not going to take you there. You need something a little bit more complex, something that is closer to the grade level they're actually at in order to go up that ramp that you showed in the previous slide. And so that certainly is one consideration. Of course, then the question is, how do you help kids master that more challenging text? And that's what's going to come up next when we talk about fluency. Other things, though, I think about are this notion, if I think about fluency, somebody who's a fluent reader, fluent speaker, is somebody who uses their voice to convey meaning. So one of the things I often look for are materials that lend themselves to expressive oral reading, things such as poetry, readers' theater scripts, even song lyrics. I think Lynne will talk a little bit about this when she talks about the fluency development lesson. And of course, another one is interest. People often ask me questions about difficulty of text. And one of the things I often say is interest trumps difficulty. If students have an interest in a text, even if it's more challenging than they would normally read, they'll find a way of working their way through that text because they have an interest, a purpose that they want to satisfy. So there's a variety of things we need to keep in mind. One of the great things about that is it opens up a wide variety of texts that we can choose from as teachers, as instructors, as clinicians. So, but there's certainly that idea of more complex texts, especially for our struggling readers, is something that we need to keep in mind if our goal is to accelerate their progress.
Yeah, I really like the way that you're kind of highlighting. Let's have a reason that we would read this text out loud, whether that's because it lends itself, like poetry or dramatic reading, or tapping into that motivation piece just from the student angle because the student really wants to read this, right? That's great.
Exactly.
So do you think that all students can benefit from some time working with grade level text, and do you think about this as an equity issue?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Kids who are reading at grade level, it's a non-question. But kids who are behind, we can't accept them progressing at the same rate as a normal developing reader. We need to accelerate their progress, and they're not going to be able to accelerate if they're kept at reading material that's below their grade level. So we do need to challenge them, and the research out there is pretty clear. I'd like to share with you a study that was done by Stephen Stahl, a great researcher who's now passed away, but he published a study in the Journal of Literacy Research. I was the editor of it at the time, about 15 years ago, and it looked at fluency instruction with low-achieving second graders back in Georgia, where he was at University of Georgia. What he found was really quite amazing. He found that fluency instruction, what we're going to be talking about in the next segment, actually works across the board, but the kids who made the greatest progress were the ones who were given material that was at a more challenging level, slightly what we would normally consider frustration level. And, the rule of thumb has always been never give kids material to frustration level. But what Steve did was the fluency piece allowed teachers to provide students with that support so they could master more difficult material. And as a result, they actually accelerated their progress. And, of course, if we're talking about equity, it's that acceleration when we can bring those kids reading at a second grade level up to a fourth grade level, then we're doing something that, meets the definition of providing equitable instruction for all children. And certainly that's a goal for all of us.
Yeah, great perspectives, Jim. I really like the, thinking about those ideas of frustrational level as these are malleable things, and teachers play an important part here, right, in fluency practice, especially.
Absolutely.
Thanks. So I'm going to let you take the helm here now to focus on fluency.
All right. Thanks, Cindy. So why does fluency matter, I guess, is the question. Because, sometimes people say, well, it's just oral reading. It's making kids read fast. And it's not that. It's actually comprehension. I'm going to give you a quick overview of it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, not Cindy, but to Lynne, who's going to actually talk about some research she has actually done here. One of the reasons we know that fluency is important is because it was identified by the National Reading Panel. Those of you who were around 20 years ago remember the National Reading Panel came up. They were given the task of identifying the scientific basis for reading instruction, what really matters. And of course, what they came up was the big five: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. And fluency was kind of a big surprise because before that, fluency was not really seen as something all that important. But really, the National Reading Panel really opened our eyes to that. And actually, since then, there's been quite a bit of research, scholarship that has reinforced this notion here. I'd like to share with you this study that was done by Sheila Valencia and her colleagues at the University of Washington there in Seattle. They looked at kids, third and fourth graders, who performed poorly on these state-mandated tests. Almost every state here in the country requires third and fourth graders to take a test in April or May toward the end of the year to test their proficiency. And it's usually a silent reading comprehension test. Kids read passages, they answer some questions. And she wasn't terribly interested in the kids who did well. Those kids, they're well on their way. She was interested in the kids who performed poorly. Why? They're performing poorly in comprehension, overall reading achievement, but why? Taking a closer look at these kids. And here's what she found. Upwards of 90% of these children exhibited problems in what we would call the foundational areas of reading. Word recognition, both phonics and vocabulary, and then automatic word recognition and prosodic reading. That's fluency. Automatic word recognition, the ability to recognize words effortlessly, and prosodic reading, which is the idea of reading with great expression. But imagine that 90%, upwards of 90% of our third, fourth graders, they all exhibit problems in comprehension. But when you take a closer look at it, we're suggesting that we could provide equitable outcomes for these kids. Really a major finding for us there. And of course, that showed up in the Handbook of Reading Research. I was privileged to write the chapter on reading fluency in the Handbook of Reading Research. And along with my colleagues, we had to look through all the research that was available at the time. And we can tell you that without question, there is a sizable amount of scientific research that supports teaching fluency, especially when we're talking about younger kids and children who are struggling in the area of reading fluency. What really got me started on this, though, I've been traveling this fluency road for, I hate to say how many years, probably, over 40 now. But it was actually an article that I read, 37 years ago? Richard Allington wrote this piece. It was in an article called Fluency, the Neglected Goal of the Reading Program. And what he said was really quite opened my eyes. He said a lack of fluency in oral reading is often noted as a characteristic of poor readers, but it is seldom treated. And boy, does that make sense? Any of us who spend any time in a classroom, you don't have to listen to children read for more than a minute or so, and you can tell whether or not fluency is an issue. They're that word-by-word reading, no enthusiasm, no expression in their voice. Yet the question is, and what Dick raised was, what do we do about it? And he argued 37 years ago, well, we really don't do much about it. I would argue that we do more, or at least we know how to do more now, but certainly was an eye-opener way back then. More recently, though, we know the Common Core standards now. Some of you may not be in states that follow the Common Core standards, but you have your own state standards. And I'll bet you dollars to donuts that your standards, whether it's the Common Core or the state standards, identify reading fluency, grades 1 through 5. And it's interesting because I would argue that it should go beyond grade 5. If students don't exit grade 5 reading fluently, they don't automatically become a fluent reader. It becomes a bit of an albatross that hangs around their necks, in some cases, for their entire lives. But certainly, we're identifying more and more the importance of reading fluency. So it is one of those areas of those 5 areas identified by the National Reading Panel. What I would like to share with you, though, is this idea that it's a bridge. You see at one end of this model here we have word study. We have to teach kids, of course, phonics and vocabulary and spelling. And at the other end, we need to help kids build their knowledge and use strategies to comprehend the text they're reading. But that fluency kind of links those two. And I'd like to kind of share that notion of a bridge with you, if I could here. There's actually 2 components to fluency. And this is what kind of makes it a little tough to understand. The first is this notion of automaticity and word recognition. That's the ability to recognize words automatically or effortlessly. You see, the idea behind automaticity that came out of the work of LaBerge and Samuels was that we, human beings, when we read, we only have a limited amount of mental energy, if you will, or attention. If we have to use too much of that attention to decoding the words, when we get around to that comprehension part of reading, we're out of gas. We've used all that energy up decoding the words. We know these kids. When they're letter by letter, sound by sound. I say, God bless these kids for working so hard, but they're putting all their effort in the wrong area. What we want them to be is like us, automatic in our word recognition. I mean, if you think about it, How often do we have to stop and sound out a word when we read? Hardly ever. Most of the words we encounter, we would call them sight words. They're automatically recognized. And what that means is we give minimal attention to the words itself. We can give maximum attention to trying to figure out what the author's trying to tell us with that text. You know, I have something I often tell my students. I teach a class here at the university called on phonics. And one of the things I often tell them is the goal of phonics instruction is to get kids not to use it. If you have to use phonics when you're reading, you know, you're in big trouble because you're sounding out every word, and that's going to be bogging you down. And how do we develop fluency, automaticity? I'll talk about that in a second, but the main way you develop automaticity in anything through lots and lots of practice. Now, the second part, though, of fluency, this notion of prosody, that's a linguistic term. But what it means is expressiveness and good phrasing in your reading. As I mentioned earlier, if I think about somebody who's a fluent reader, it's not somebody who reads fast or gets all the words right. It's somebody who uses their voice to make meaning. They get loud and soft and fast and slow. They have dramatic pauses. And all those things help us understand what it is that we read. They reify and magnify the text, the meaning of the text that we're reading. So we want to work on both of those. And the problem sometimes is that automaticity part gets a little bit more attention than get halfway across that bridge there. It's the prosody that is equally important. And I love this quote by Maya Angelou in her poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse meaning with deeper shades of meaning. Boy, isn't that the truth? It's not just the words that carry the meaning. It's the way you say the words and the way you emphasize the words. The example I often use is the word dude. I've used this for a number of years. Our young people use that word dude a lot, but it can mean a lot of things. If you were to say hello to somebody, you'd say, dude. But if you were to express consternation, you'd say, dude. Or if you were to ask a question, you'd say, dude. Or if you just won the Powerball lottery, it'd be dude. You know, the same word doesn't change, but the way you say it changes the meaning. And it's not just when you read orally. I think most of us would recognize that even when we read silently, we hear that internal voice. And we want to develop that voice, whether it's orally or silent reading here. So fluency does contribute to comprehension. It is that bridge. An important question is, to what extent does it influence comprehension? And one of the things I did was I looked at a variety of studies that have been done that ranged all the way from first grade up through ninth grade, and tried to determine the extent to which fluency predicted or contributed to comprehension. And the number to look there is at the bottom left-hand corner, 20 to 83%. This 20 to 80% of the variance in comprehension could be explained by reading fluency. That's huge. Even the lower number, 20%. Imagine if we could improve students' comprehension, their overall reading achievement, by 20%, that low number. That would take so many kids out of that at-risk category. And if we could get toward that 50 to 80%, I think we could take many, many, many kids and really solve the literacy crisis that we're having in our country, and for that matter, around the world. So fluency is important. It's related to comprehension. It's the bridge from word study to comprehension. How do you teach it? Well, I'll go through this very quickly, and then I'm going to shift it over to Lynne to talk to you about a particular lesson. But first of all, we need to devote time to it. I would like to suggest 15 to 20 minutes per day. I know time in any classroom is precious. My colleague Tim Shanahan, who was at one time the director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools, mandated that 30 minutes be devoted to reading fluency instruction. And he really got some great results, by the way. 30 minutes is a lot of time. I would like to say, maybe we can narrow that down a little bit, keep it down to 15 to 20 minutes per day, maybe a little bit longer for children who really need some additional help here. But the tools then that you apply, I like to think of these as colors on your palette, your instructional palette. We need to model fluent reading for our kids, read out loud to them. We know that children who are read to on a regular basis are more motivated to read, more enthusiastic about reading. They have larger vocabularies. They have better comprehension. But also we're providing students with a model of what they should be sounding like when they read. When I read to kids, we often talk about Mr. Rasinski's reading. Did you notice how I changed my voice when I became a different character? What were you thinking when I sped up here, but I slowed down here? What were you thinking when I had this long dramatic pause? I want them to notice that I was using my voice to improve their understanding and their satisfaction with that read aloud. So important, this reading aloud to kids. But the problem with that is when you read to your students, you're doing the reading, they aren't. So let's move on here. Assisted reading, that's where you read to students. That's where students read something and they're hearing at the same time a fluent rendering of the same text. So, and I threw in some names here. Keith Topping, psychologist from the United Kingdom, has done quite a bit of work with this, with his what he called paired reading. But it could be sitting side by side with a teacher or a parent or even a classmate reading out loud together. Or it could be reading a book and listening to a recorded version of that same text. Something very powerful happens when the student is reading a text and hearing it at the same time. In fact, one of the easiest things to do is caption television, where students are, of course, when they're watching television with the captions on, they're seeing the words and they're also hearing them at the same time. Again, I like to point out that Jim Trelease, in his famous book, The Read Aloud Handbook, tried to explain why children in Finland do so well in reading, at least in the elementary grades. And he said one of the reasons for that is because apparently all the television programs in Finland are captioned, and of course, apparently you can't turn it off. It's on all the time. So, variety of ways for that to happen, whether it's reading with a partner, reading with a group chorally, reading with a recorded text, watching captioned television. Wide reading practice. Now, how do you become fluent in anything? Just practice, right? Wide reading practice, and this is what Dick Ellington talks a lot about, is the kind of reading we do a lot of as adults. This afternoon when I read the newspaper, I'll go from one article to the next. Reading it one time, digesting it and moving on. And certainly that's something that is important. We do a lot of in school. We read a story, we talk about it, we do some extension activities, and then we move on to the next text with our students here. But for some students, that's not enough, especially if you are a student who is, on the borderline, you're struggling. You read that text one time, you don't read it very well, certainly not as well as the more proficient readers. For those kids, we need to say, guys, we need to read that again and perhaps again and again and again, 3 or 4 times. That's called repeated reading. Now, I often also call it deep reading, and some people call it close reading. Dr. Jay Samuels at the University of Minnesota was the guy who really brought this to our attention with a famous article called The Method of Repeated Readings. Here's the key to this, asking kids to read something multiple times. When you read something 2 or 3 or 4 times, of course, you get better on the piece you practice. Right? That's your word recognition improves, your fluency improves, your comprehension improves. But what really matters is what happens next. These students, when they move on to a new text, they've never seen this new text before. There's actually improvements there that you would not have been expected if you had just went from one text to the next, practicing that first text, let's call it passage A, leads to improvements in passage B. And then we practice passage B, and that leads to improvements in passage C. These passages are actually getting more challenging, more complex, if you will. And even though they're getting more complex, we're seeing students actually exhibiting success in this. This has been shown over and over again in research that has been done, I'd say, over 30 years. And I can clearly say that this is based on science now. So the question, though, becomes, how do you get kids into repeated readings? Do you just say to your students, let's read this 5 times and then we'll move on? You'll get a lot of rolling eyes. And I think you'll notice when Lynne chats, she'll talk about having kids perform. If you're going to perform a text, you're going to want to rehearse. In fact, this particular presentation, we've been rehearsing this as a group here for over several days. And why? Because we want to do a meaningful presentation for you out there who are listening to this. Well, let's talk about one more thing, the focus on phrasing here. If you think about it, what is the hallmark of a disfluent reader? It's that kid who reads in that word-by-word manner. And one of the things we know, I think I heard Rob Tierney say this once. He said the natural unit of reading is not the word, it's the phrase, the noun phrase, the verb phrase, the prepositional phrase. And what we want kids to do is to read in those phrases, not that word by word manner. That's where meaning lies. If you think about it, think of what a preposition means. Could anybody define for me what the word if means, if or of, of, or the noun marker the? By themselves, they're very limited in their meaning. They have to be part of a phrase. So helping kids learn to read in phrases can be really quite helpful in developing fluency. One of the things I often do is when I teach high-frequency words, I teach them not only in isolation, individually, but also in the context of phrases. You can find my phrases on my website, which will be mentioned, I believe, at the end of this session. But these are the tools that we use. And the key as a teacher is to choose the tools that work best and combine them as much as possible here. I came across this article just a couple of years ago. It was a review of the research on fluency. And it was in the Journal of Learning Disabilities. If we're talking about equity, children who are behind, kids who are experiencing difficulty, those are the ones that we need to try to bring up to snuff. Well, anyways, in this journal, they basically asked the question, to what extent does fluency interventions actually improve reading? And what the result was, the conclusion was, there at the bottom paragraph, results show that repeated reading, okay, talked about that, assisted reading with audiobooks, okay, we talked about that, and multi-component interventions, that is putting these tools together into a coherent whole, produce gains not only in reading fluency but comprehension. Essentially what we're talking about is helping kids cross that bridge to the promised land, which of course is understanding what it is they read and understanding material that is at their grade level, which would they need to be at. So with that, I'm going to talk about, or turn it over to Lynne, and talk about the fluency development lesson. This is one of these lessons that actually takes those tools that I talked about and puts them together into some coherent whole. And Lynne had got some remarkable results, and I'm not going to tell you because I'll let her tell you her story. So Lynne, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I hope you don't mind if I jump in every once in a while as you present.
No, thank you so much, Tim. Again, I just want to reiterate, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And yes, it is my ultimate pleasure to actually share with all of you the fluency development lesson. It is also affectionately known as the SDL. And before I go into sort of what is this fluency development lesson and how do you implement it, I want to provide you with a context because I think the context is pretty important. So back in the early to mid-90s, I was working for the Georgia Department of Education, actually in the FLES program. And at that time, I decided to get my master's degree in elementary education. And I don't think, Tim, you're even aware of this, but the first time I met you was I had attended a national conference. It might have been ALER, but it was in Georgia. And I went to one of Tim's sessions. And I remember thinking, okay, Lynne, note to self, you have got to keep this guy on your radar. And, back in the early 90s, we certainly didn't have social media. So following someone, so to speak, was a little challenging. But honest to goodness, Tim, if you looked at my personal home library, I think I have purchased and read just about every book you've written. I've downloaded every article and with, great purpose because I really wanted to soak up everything Tim had to say about fluency, comprehension development, etc. And so fast forward to the early 2000s, I had my master's in elementary education, and I had moved back to my home state of Ohio. And it is here that I decided I would implement the fluency development lesson every day without fail, regardless of the grades I taught. And at the time in elementary, I had taught first, second, and third. And long story short, it had proven such incredible, successful results for my students. And, just a short anecdote, my first year implementing the FDL, I had 20, I will not forget, 27 first graders, 13 of whom had been identified at risk based on early reading screeners. In addition,
Wow.
I had five English learners in my classroom, 2 from China, 1 from Poland, who had come from France, so English was her third language, 1 from Germany, and 1 from Mexico. And I remember sort of wanting to hit that panic button. What am I going to do to make certain that all of these 27 students not only promote to second grade, but are reading at grade level by the time they leave my classroom? Well, little did I know that the answer was really going to be easy. It was that fluency development lesson. Now, that's not to say that I didn't implement, our district scoping sequence and our curricula, and, I did all of that. But what I chose to do was this lesson every day during my morning meeting sort of scenario. So every day I did a morning meeting routine, which was about 30 to 40 minutes, encompassing literacy and math activities. And the fluency development lesson was usually 10 to 15 minutes of that morning meeting. So let me talk a little bit about what it is, and then sort of my journey using it, and I'll go into a daily lesson plan for you and sort of spell out how you can implement it in your classroom. So Tim, I recall reading, this was probably one of the first articles, and I think the date was 1994, where you, along with your colleagues, Nancy Paddock from Kent State University, and then I think Lynne and Sturtevant, were they both from Texas, or maybe just one of them? I can't recall. Both from Texas. Okay.
Wayne Lynne and Betty Sturtevant, they were actually graduate students of ours, and then they moved. Betty went to Maryland, and Wayne Lynne ended up at Texas A&M. So, but they were with us at Kent State at the time.
Okay, super.
And
so I remember reading
give you a little
article.
bit of back.
Yeah.
Can I give you just a quick overview? Yeah, we were talking about,
Sure.
we've been chatting about these fluency and, those various tools. And we said, let's try to put these things together, put all these tools together into a whole. And we were able to get into a couple inner city schools in Akron where there are a lot, like you had in your own classroom, lots of kids who are really at risk that could benefit from equitable instruction. And we tried this, and we were absolutely stunned by the results, much the same results that you received. And so that was the beginning of that journey. And of course, you picked it up then when you read the article, and you made it work for you. So it's interesting how one these things evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, when you look at the name Fluency Development Lesson, obviously it is there's a focus on fluency instruction. However, as Tim mentioned earlier, he talked about the big 5 ideas in reading instruction identified by the National Reading Panel. This lesson, this 10 to 15 minute lesson, actually embeds all of those big 5 reading ideas into a single lesson, all the while you're working on building student fluency. It also includes evidence-based strategies that Tim has alluded to earlier: echo reading, choral reading, repeated reading, and partner reading. It also allows for some culminating activities, whether that's reader's theater or, as I like to say, poetry party, because at the end of each year, first, second, third grade, I had a big poetry party where all the students performed their favorite poems, and we invited everyone in. But what I want to talk about is that I used poetry as my genre of choice, and I know this is Tim's favorite genre, but you don't have to use poetry. I would argue that it lends itself so well to this because it's fun, it's exciting, it's so rich in language and syntax, but there's nothing that says you can't take a paragraph or 2 out of that social studies text and implement the fluency development lesson using that text. You see here on the screen a poem. It's called The Mummy by Shel Silverstein. So fast forward to about 2007, I decided I would work on my doctorate degree. And it was no surprise that I chose to implement or focus on fluency instruction with English language learners or English learners. And long story short, I think Tim and I met up at a conference, and I was working on my doctorate at the University of Akron, and he at Kent State. Were sort of sister universities, if you will. And he came up and he said, hey, I heard you're using my FDL with English learners. I'd love to be on your dissertation. And I said, well, I don't know. No, I'm like elated, jumping for joy. Like, if Tim comes knocking, you open the door. So we then were able to collaborate a little bit. And so long story short, I used my doctoral research in which I worked with Korean Burmese refugee children in the Akron Public Schools for a year and a half, and I implemented this lesson. So let me go ahead just very quickly, because I know we want to get to Q&A. I'm going to kind of walk you through a skeleton lesson plan. So kind of buckle your seatbelt and stay with me here. On Monday morning, I would introduce the new poem. Now, this is before there were smartboards, right? So I had the poem hanging on a chart, and those first graders would come running in, literally putting their backpacks down to look at and see what the poem would be for the week. During morning meeting, I'd read the poem several times, modeling a good fluent read. We would talk, we'd include comprehension. What is the poet's purpose and style? What should we understand from reading this poem and this message? And then we'd peel it apart, right? We'd look for rhymes, and I taught them onomatopoeias and alliteration, and we looked at all sorts of syntax and what to do when we see quotation marks and semicolons. And then I would have the students chorally echo me. So again, I'm not asking them to read a grade level passage, and that's important. These passages were at grade level, even though I had 13 or more students who weren't reading at grade level. So I had them chorally echo me. Tuesday morning, oh, look, it's the same poem. Are the students going to grow weary of reading the same poem? Absolutely not. You change up your purpose. You might even change up your audience. So I reread the poem. I am hitting hard those components of fluency, rate, accuracy, and prosody. I explicitly taught those to the students. My first graders knew what prosody meant. We would chorally read it. Then I would start to relinquish a little power. I would have groups of students read different stanzas. I would color code the lines in the poem, and all the students wearing, pants would read the red stanza, etc. And then we would do some word work. So depending on our scope and sequence for phonological awareness and phonics, I would look at, helping the students identify long, short vowels, digraphs, clusters, synonyms, antonyms, etc. Quickly, Wednesday, again, I'm going to relinquish more power. The students and teachers chorally read the poem, and now I'm going to ask the students to partner up and read together. Partners are coached to provide feedback, constructive feedback. They're going to rate their reader on accuracy, automaticity, and prosody. And then I ask for volunteers, those who are confident, to go ahead and read for the class. Thursday is a big day, because now we're going to chorally read. We're going to self-evaluate based on those fluency components. I'm going to ask for more volunteers to read, and now I'm going to embed writing. We know that reading and writing are synergistic. So my students would do, a writing or close activity. If you follow Tim on Twitter, he talks a lot about word ladders. So those are some of the activities I would implement. And then for homework, yes, homework, the students were sent home with a poetry folder, and they were asked to read that poem to a family member. The family member signed off, and on the back of the poem was a writing activity that I wanted the students to do. And you can imagine that writing activity increased in difficulty based on the grade level and the time of year. Now, Friday morning, the culminating day, right? Students bring their poetry folders back. I'm reading their written responses, and I'm responding to them. Now the students are going to perform that poem for a 5th time or more, because oftentimes we're reading it a couple times a day. But this time they're going to read it with emotion because they're much more confident. So we're going to be sick or tired or angry. And then we're going to perform for different audiences. I used to wheel that poem, that chart, across the hall to the other first grade classroom, and we would all huddle inside the other room and we would perform it for the other class. I had Mr. Mark was the beloved custodian. He would come in our room. I'd say, hey, Mr. Mark, come listen to my incredible reader. So see, we're switching up the purpose for reading and the audience. And then we did a mystery reader activity. I would select a couple students to read it. I'd send some students in the hall. I would record those students who were reading on my old tape recorder. We'd invite the students in the hall back in the room and replay the recording, and they had to guess the mystery readers. And I will tell you, by the end of the year, those 13 at-risk students, those ELs, not only were they asking to be the mystery readers, they were disguising their voices to try to trick the students who were guessing who the mystery reader was. So I'm going to quickly pass it back to Tim here to end us up. What I want to call out again is that this is a lesson that can be done remotely. So those of you teaching from home and your students are from home, it's perfect to do at home. You can have your students in their little breakout sessions in their Google Meet rooms, and they can partner up and read the same poem. You change up the audience, you change up the purpose, you know, sort of wordsmith that poem and you peel it apart. And that way you're encompassing all of those big 5 ideas in reading. So one of the culminating activities is, go ahead, Tim.
Actually, Lynne, I got a question for you. I'm going to go back here. I love your idea of a mystery reader. I hadn't thought about that, having kids read in different voices and challenging the other kids to figure out who's actually doing the reading. But what kind of results did you get in your study?
Yeah, it was incredible. So, you know, when I used it first, second, and third grade, you know, all students, so that first year, those students, those 13 at risk who were participating in Title I and a couple in reading recovery, promoted to second grade, not one of them continued in Title I services, and only 1 out of the 5 ELs continued any kind of TESOL instruction. You know, it was incredible. And then when I, you know, completed my doctoral research, you'll probably recall, you know, I did a case study on 3 of those English learners, and the results were incredible. Classroom teachers were thrilled. You know, I just can't say enough about the success that I experienced. And I should add, Tim, quickly, and I know we're running out of time, but, you know, good news travels fast. So I'll never forget, in my elementary building, not only was I implementing the FTL, but so were my other colleagues. And then I remember getting phone calls from teachers in the district who were at other elementaries, and they would say, hey, what's this, like, fluency lesson you're doing, and can you talk to us about the poetry party? We want to do the same thing. So, you know, it really had spread.
You know, I think that the best research is that it is actually done in the trenches like you did. You know, it's one thing for college professors to control everything and do the research and things turn out just right, but when you know, can be there in the trenches and you have to deal with all the day-to-day issues and still see progress kids make, you know, that really is really quite convincing. I'd like to share a colleague of mine. Her name's Lorraine Griffith. I don't know if she's listening in or not. She teaches down in North Carolina. She tried something very similar with her own students there, and what she found is over the course of a year doing this, her students, her struggling readers, made over 2 years progress in reading. And it wasn't simply they were reading faster. They were. More importantly, they were reading with better comprehension. They were crossing that bridge. So over and over again, we see, regardless of the grade level, if our issue is try to provide equitable instruction to help those students make that leap back to where they should be in terms of grade level, this could be a real game changer for those kids. I'm going to switch to one more slide. I love your notion of having kids perform. Go back here. I went too far. This is my, okay. I can't get the thing going right. This is my own family here. I'm there in the upper left-hand corner, and I have 4 kids who live in different parts of the country. And we very often do something very similar to that, where we have a family Zoom night on Sunday nights. And what I might do is on a Saturday morning or Sunday morning, I'll send out a poem and I'll break it up into parts. And everybody has to rehearse it in various ways. And then they have a reason to rehearse. And the reason for that is come Sunday night when we get together, we have our grand performance for one another. And, you know, it's just a lot of fun having that opportunity to get together and do something as a family, even though we're we're several thousand miles away from one another. So, in this age of COVID and remote learning, we need to think of great ways of making this kind of instruction work for our kids. So certainly something we can try. By the way, if you notice the bottom right-hand corner there, that's my grandson, Carter. He just found out today that he has a new brother, and I'm a new grandfather. So we say hello to Ryan Nicholas Rasinski in Oklahoma. Just brand new baby.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
All right. I guess that's a pretty good way of ending things here. So what we're going to do is open it up for questions. All right. Derek, do you have any questions for us?
Oh, Tim, we've got lots of questions, so thank you. Thanks, Cindy, Lynn, Tim, for the great information. I think let's start there, right where we ended, on that idea. A lot of folks want to know about translating not only the FDL, but other fluency instruction into online learning and distance learning situations. What recommendations do the panelists have? Tim, let's start with you.
For turning it in remote learning environments? Yeah,
that's correct. Yes, thank you.
But the neat thing about fluency is, though, what we're talking about is oral reading, and oral reading, oral performance of reading can be done, in classroom, and it doesn't take too much of an adaptation to do it, via Zoom or whatever remote learning device you're using. Having kids record material. One of the things I've been using lately has been VoiceThread. It's an application where I can record myself reading something and send it out to my students. They can listen to me read, and then they can record their own voice and send it back to me. Many more apps. I'm not nearly as technologically advanced as my students are, but there are so many things that are available now. It just takes a matter of digging in and trying them out, knowing that you might fail first times through, but stay at it. Stay at it. The goal, regardless of whether you're doing online, in person, is helping students develop that proficient oral reading that will lead to good comprehension. Lynn, Cindy, do you have any ideas?
I think, Tim, you kind of hit it. Yeah, it's very easy to do in a remote setting. All students have that text, and they can go into their breakout rooms and read together, and then rejoin that main room and read with their teacher. Yeah, it's almost seamless, right?
Yeah.
Also,
well,
it really lends.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cindy, go.
Just going to say that, fluency is something that really lends itself to who you've got, in your family, giving performances or practicing. I have, at times talked about even reading to the family pet, if that's who's available as you're practicing, right? That having an audience there in person as you're practicing is kind of a natural for turning to not just your classmates or your teacher, but to your parents or to your siblings, anyone.
Yeah, I'll second that, Cindy. Dogs are great listeners. They love to listen to kids read. Cats, not so much, but dogs for sure. There, but yeah, one of the things back in the day when we were doing the fluency development lesson, the kids take the poem home. We say, read it to anybody. We call it the lucky listener. And that could be calling grandma up on the phone and reading to her or grandpa. But now, of course, we can do it through Zoom or these other platforms that are so easy to use.
Thanks, Tim. So we've had a number of questions. Folks are really interested about what the panelists think about identifying grade level texts. What are your kind of trusted resources? And what types of information should folks be looking at? And then furthermore, kind of at the heart of the presentation, what kind of scaffolds can we continue to provide for students who maybe aren't reading at grade level yet?
This is Cindy.
Well,
let me
go, Cindy.
Can I just start by saying, at NWEA, we specifically do partner with Metametrics, who offer the Lexile framework. And that includes a new Lexile oral reading framework it's a piece of data that comes out of map reading fluency. But we're kind of aware that most schools operationalize that sort of grade levelness in relation to some particular system, and that's not always Lexile. I think that, one thing to notice is that you can, at least at sort of at a basic level, you can find a walk across between these various systems and scales online. So to me, it's less critical to, say exactly which system is it that your school or class is using to define what that grade level text is, but it's about those high targets, those reach complex grade level text as described in standards, one way or another, operationalized. Tim?
Yep. Yeah, good point, Cindy. And then in terms of support, I think Lynne hit on that when she was describing that fluency development lesson. We in our profession, we call it the gradual release of responsibility, where early on we support the student by reading the text to them, having them follow along silently. Later on, as they develop some familiarity with the text, we read it together, out loud together, and then they might practice it on their own several times, us giving them some coaching along the way. So we begin with us, the teacher, with the responsibility, but gradually giving that responsibility over to the student. And if we do something like Lynne has with that poetry party, if we give them a reason to rehearse, then it's not something that's some sort of drudgery. It's something that kids will want to do and want to feel successful at. There's nothing better than feeling like you're the star of the class because you got to perform. One of my favorite articles it came out of the reading teacher on that. It was called "I Never Thought I Could Be a Star: A Reader's Theater Ticket to Reading Fluency," where kids actually got to be the performers, the stars, and these oftentimes the lowest achieving kids in the classroom.
Thanks, Tim. There's been several questions around the amount of time dedicated in the classroom to fluency development, and thinking about Lynne's lesson in both across different grade levels. Lynne, do you have a recommendation about the amount of time that should be spent on this, and does that change at different grade levels?
Sure, happy to address that. So, oh yeah, go ahead, Tim.
Go ahead.
Oh,
no, you started. Go ahead.
Sure. It's a little challenging remotely here. So, as Tim mentioned, I think early on that, his colleague Tim Shanahan talked about 30 minutes of fluency instruction each day, and Tim suggested more like, whether it's 15 or 20 minutes. When I implemented it, it was on average 10 to 15 minutes a day. And it really depends, right? Is it a longer poem? Is it spring of that grade level? Is the text more complex? So it really depends on, you kind of let that text complexity guide the work as far as how much time you want to spend. And oftentimes, trust your students. And you also need to understand how much scaffolding you need to provide them. So if you're choosing a poem that is, rather complex, even though it's at grade level, but there's some vocabulary that students may not have encountered before, maybe some words that are multi-syllable, more difficult to decode, and already from good, valid, reliable data that you've got students that have some gaps in their decoding skills, then you need to do sort of a pre-reading activity, right? When you think about reading instruction, we look at it sort of, at least I do, in terms of thirds. What am I going to do prior to engaging in the reading? What am I going to do with the students while they're reading? And what activities am I going to do after they read to help them be successful with that text? So really, it just depends, but typically it was about 15 minutes a day. And as Tim mentioned, it easily transfers, to their other subjects and their skills in reading brand new cold text. So Tim, go ahead.
I'd like to just throw in a couple of thoughts also. The neat thing about fluency is that we can dedicate time to it, as Lynne mentioned. It can also fit into those nooks and crannies throughout the school day. Whenever the school day starts or right before lunchtime, why can't we throw a poem or other text up on the whiteboard and read it together chorally? Or perhaps sing a song toward the end of the day, always with the words in front of the kids so that, they're actually doing some reading there. I'm thinking finding ways of integrating it into different subject areas. Today, We're doing this webinar right now on November 19th. It is the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. Why not have students on the 18th, yesterday, take that text as part of social studies and analyze it and you know, come today after they've rehearsed it, you know, become little Mr. Lincolns and perform at least part of that. That would, you know, fulfill lots of our social studies standards, but at the same time give students a chance to experiment and play around with fluency.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Tim. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Lynne and Cindy, for sharing your time and expertise as well. That brings us to the end of our presentation today. We have many questions, and unfortunately didn't have time to get to all of them, but I want to thank everyone for coming and participating and bringing your great questions for the presenters. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this presentation and a PDF of the presentation slides. If you'd like to have an NWEA assessment specialist contact you to discuss needs, particularly fluency assessment needs at your district, please use the Contact Us button on your webinar console. And don't forget to fill out that survey on the way out to let us know how we did and what other content you'd like to see in the future. On behalf of NWEA and our presenters, thank you for taking the time to join us today. To learn more about NWEA and our assessment solutions, please visit nwea.org. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.